Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining the EDC Coffee Chat. We are very honored to have the Honorable Representative Mike Chapman from the 24th District on with us this morning. And he is, of course, at the end of the legislative session working on bills, and actually now it's really focused on the 3 budgets. So we'll let him talk to us about that and let us know what's going forward and what he thinks is what are hitting roadblocks. And we'll open it up for questions after Mike has an opportunity to give a brief overview at the beginning. And then also just a few housekeeping items, if I may. Please keep yourself on mute so we don't inadvertently pick up any background noise. If you want to ask a question, please raise your virtual hand, or alternatively, you can put your message in the chat and we'll go ahead and ask it on your behalf if you'd like. So with that, I will let Representative Chapman take it away. And thank you so much for joining us, Mike. Really appreciate you. Everything you do.
You bet. Thanks. It's good to be here. Look, I want to get to folks' questions because I think that's obviously always the most important. I will say, other than the budgets, I think there were kind of 3 issues that the legislature kind of came in to take a look at this year. I think we took 2 big steps the last 2 nights on what I thought were 2 of the biggest issues. One was around the police pursuit legislation that I think many folks are aware that police had kind of felt like the legislature had tied their hands to pursue people that they deemed necessary to be apprehended. So both the House and the Senate have now passed a police pursuit reform that reinstates the reasonable suspicion as opposed to the probable cause requirement for the police to pursue. The Senate and the House both passed bipartisan pursuit legislation. Both are very similar. There will be a conference report to bring them in line. I will say on that particular piece of, and we debated that Monday night until after midnight. So that was a bill that ends up being a bipartisan bill. Both Steve and I voted in favor. Senator Vandeweghe voted in favor in the Senate, where they also had a bipartisan bill. I will say it was bipartisan in both its support. Both the support was bipartisan and both the opposition was bipartisan. So these were pieces of legislation that I would classify as the far left and the far right were opposed, but a large coalition in the middle worked together to get to yes. And I believe that bill will be fairly easy, and that will give the police lower the threshold, allow them to go back to do the job that they need to do to make sure that our communities are safe. The other piece of legislation that really is overhanging was, if you remember, a couple of years ago, the Supreme Court basically invalidated all drug possession law. We put a fix in place, but part of that fix in place really took the tools away from the police to make an arrest if they saw illegal drug use being used in public. Again, the House and the Senate have now passed legislation reinstating that is in the Senate version, it's a gross misdemeanor. In the House version, it would be a misdemeanor. We'll have to concur. I think we'll end up with a gross misdemeanor, but it puts arrest back on the table with the goal of first-time arrestees, get them into diversion and treatment programs as quick as possible. And should they complete their treatment, they could have their criminal record, cleared out. For those that are repeat offenders, it reinstates penalties, jail time. Again, more of a bipartisan effort in the Senate, less so last night, although I think those who were opposed last night can get to yes if some of the Senate provision. I think the Senate bill would have passed bipartisan in the House. The House took a little more, the House committee took a little more of a different tact, but I think in concurrence, I'm confident the Senate version will probably end up taking the lead. So that will give our police folks the tools they need to in essence, not have this kind of open drug use and open running away from police, maybe bring a little law and order, but also making sure that people do get the treatment they need and the help they need. So I think that was a huge issue. Housing was obviously another huge issue, and a fairly significant middle housing bill was passed, allowing for more infill, more density, a bill supported by builders and realtors, a bill that I'm not wildly enthused about, but at the end of the day, we probably, it does, as one Republican senator said, this isn't the ultimate property rights piece of legislation, because if you want to put a second dwelling on your piece of property, you should be allowed to do so. So local governments are going to have to do some work. And I think that, again, is a pretty good bipartisan effort. I think there's a lot of devil in the details, and I think it'll be a year or so before our local jurisdictions really have the plans in place. But in essence, we should be setting up a framework where we can build more duplexes and more ADUs in city limits. Pretty frustrated that a bill that I had that came out of committee would have allowed standalone ADUs in the rural areas, but that ran into a buzzsaw from the governor's office, and they squashed it at the next step. Pretty frustrating, because their point was they didn't want to see more sprawl, but we have a lot of houses that sit on 2.5, 5, 10 acres, and they should be allowed to put an ADU as well on their property. I think if we're going to kind of jam a lot of ADUs into the cities, but that's it's a fight for another day. And then finally, on our operating budgets, give full credit. So the House and the Senate passed an operating budget, the 2 transportation budgets and the 2 capital budgets. As usual, the 2 capital budgets were bipartisan in both the House and the Senate, and Representative Theringer is working on concurrence there. The 2 transportation budgets, as usual, I think they were virtually unanimous, not uncommon. What is uncommon is that the Senate, and as a House member, it's difficult for me to praise the Senate too much, but I'm going to give them, they passed a bipartisan operating budget. One of the first, I think the first that I've seen in my time in Olympia. And the House is close, but we just weren't able, our budget team wasn't able to get to a bipartisan House budget. But I will agree that the Senate has taken a more kind of cautious approach to the economy, put more money into the rainy day fund, didn't spend quite as much money, and they were able to get quite a few Republican votes for their budget. And sometimes I read the Seattle Times and see their editorials, and gosh, they had one over the weekend that was infuriating, supporting a rail labor bill that they clearly don't even know what the bill does. And I've been working my butt off to kill it. It would just devastate our supply chain. But they won't write an editorial about a bipartisan operating budget out of the Senate and the good work that the Senate did. But I think it would behoove me to say that, I desperately hope the House can get moved to the Senate's direction and we can have a bipartisan operating budget as well. That would be a breath of fresh air in Olympia. And, a lot of good, it's just a great approach. So I think, those are, other than the work in my committee, the House Ag and Natural Resource Committee, I think we passed a number of good pieces of legislation out of the committee that I chair. We passed them virtually, we really worked in a bipartisan manner. Unfortunately, we just ran into a buzzsaw at the governor's office, and pretty much everything we passed out that was good for ag and good for natural resource industry has all died because of the governor's opposition. So that's, it's frustrating, but I'm still proud of the work the committee did. And, Ron Allen, I don't know if Ron, sometimes he's on this call. I don't see if he's here.
I don't think so. I don't think he is.
No. Again, I would be less of a public servant if I didn't take every opportunity when I speak to folks in Clallam County. Ron Allen stepped up to work on a bill to help the ag community set aside some riparian buffers for salmon recovery. And Ron Allen and the president of the Washington Farm Bureau, Rosella Mosby, both put incredible amount of time on the riparian bill, fully voluntary riparian bill that my committee passed out 11-0. But Ron, with calls with the governor's office, working with the Farm Bureau, working with farmers. Also, Ron just worked with virtually every tribe in the state to build support. And if you ever get a chance, if you, so be it, pull up the public hearing that we had with Ron Allen as chair of the Jamestown Tribe and Rosella Mosby, president of the Farm Bureau, sitting side by side, testifying in favor of an issue that has divided the ag community and tribes for quite some time. And then our second panel, which was really impressive, was Willie Frank Jr., the chair of the Nisqually tribe, sitting side by side with Jim Wilcox, basically the founding farmer of Wilcox Family Farm, sitting side by side, also speaking on behalf of ag and tribes in support of our bill, working together. One of the more moving moments, you don't get many in this job. It's always tradition because of their position, both as tribal chairs, that when tribal chairs sign in to testify in committee, even if they're on a panel, the tribal chairs go first. So I had talked to Willie Frank Jr. before the hearing and said, hey, Jim Wilcox is going to be there. And Willie was like, I want to be on the panel with Jim Wilcox. And I said, okay, great. And I said, I'll call on you first. He said, no, you won't. You're going to call on Jim Wilcox first, because if you know the history between the Wilcox family farms and Billy Frank Jr., Willie's father, Willie said, no, Jim goes first. And I said, well, Mr. Chairman, if I do that, people are going to look at me like I'm breaking protocol. And he said, no, I'm going to put it on the record. So he made it clear that he would not testify until Jim Wilcox, who's in his 80s and a farmer in Nisqually, and talking about the history of the Nisqually River, Billy Frank Jr., Jim Wilcox, how they came together to build the Nisqually plan that really was a framework for river restoration and working with farms around the state. But Ron Allen has just stepped up and again, significant opposition from the governor's office. I'm not here to bash the governor's office, but I do not understand the governor's office. When we brought ag and tribes together, I do not understand his opposition on that issue. And that has been just brutally frustrating, but I'm proud of the work the committee did, bringing Republicans, and then finally, and it's all just, like I said, I work till 1:30, so just give me a little bit of it. But this has nothing to do with Clallam County, but it has a really cool story. Representative Kretz represents Northeast Washington, where they are inundated with wolves. There are more wolves in Northeast Washington than the entire state needs to meet our recovery plan. But we can't get Fish and Wildlife to delist the wolves in Northeast Washington, even though the federal government has delisted them in Northeast Washington. So Representative Kretz brought a bill forward to allow of a process for delisting of wolves in Northeast Washington, because his cattle ranchers, they're being inundated with predation happening right now. Generally, I have a member in the committee from Federal Way, a member from South Tacoma, a member from Bothell, and a member from Kirkland on the Democrat side. So these are wolves in Northeast Washington are not front and center probably for these members. So Representative Kretz brought the bill forward. I co-sponsored it. We had a hearing. It went decent. It went well. Representative Kretz made a great case. When we caucus, the Republicans will go in one room and the Democrat. When we caucus, Representative Kretz wanted to come and address the Democratic caucus on his bill. And I said, yeah, come on in. And that never happens. Just that alone right there. And Representative Kretz is the deputy minority leader of the Republican Party. So he comes into the my committee caucus, and we're going to talk about the bill. And he starts to just share from his heart. And he says, look, I'm not asking for you to vote for this bill. I'm here to tell you that I didn't bring it forward to put any of you in a tough spot. And he said, I realize Tacoma, Federal Way, where you're from, wolves are not your issue. You may have constituents that don't like this piece of legislation. And he talked for about 8 minutes. And he just said, I'm just here to tell you what my heart was. My heart was not to put any of you in a bad spot. I expect that all of you probably will have to vote no. I just wanted, and he just spoke from the heart. And he walks out of the room. And in our committee, there wasn't really a dry eye amongst us. And I just looked at the committee and I said, it's up to you. You guys just let me know where you're at with the bill. One by one, from Kirkland and Bothell and Federal Way and Tacoma, they're like, are you kidding? We're voting for that bill. And so we moved a wolf bill for Northeast Washington with urban Democrats. there was one member who I know her district, and she was, she was getting kind of beat up from her constituents. And so the morning of the vote, I walked into this representative's office and I said, look, I know you're getting beat up. I see the emails you're getting. You don't have to vote for the, it'd be okay if you vote no. And I mean, I'm sorry, this is real, but she just looks at me and she goes, Mike, my district likes steak too. And I'm a yes. Pretty cool moment. And I think in the mix of politics and all the this, that, and the other thing, we can do this. We can work together. Both parties can come together and find solutions. And then, so anyway, long story. Thanks for letting me share. I'll get to your questions now. Back to the issues of our community, but I know one thing, those members are going to be with us on Clallam County issues as well, and around timber, around DNR issues. So we're building, we built a really good team. One final thing, Representative Dent, who's the ranking member for Moses Lake, he co-sponsored the legislation and shepherded through the orca recovery bill. And as he said, I don't have any orcas in Moses Lake, but I do like working with the members in the committee to find solutions to problems that we face as a state. So anyway.
Great. Hey, it's really heartening to hear the bipartisan stories where, nationwide, I think there's so much vitriol, and to find a pathway forward with people that, care about our state, care about our communities. It doesn't all, I can never be a politician other than, Port, which is nonpartisan, and EDC is nonpartisan, because I think so often there's more allegiance to a party or your caucus than there is to your constituents and, what's in the best interest of everyone. So I really applaud you for that. And I think you see things the same way. And I just, that's great to hear these kind of stories. I personally really appreciate that. So I'm sure folks have lots of questions for Representative Chapman. And if anyone wants to kick it off, they certainly may. I'd like to hear a little bit more. I serve on the county's housing committee, and I know that's been such a huge, I've quit tracking it, quite frankly, because there have been so many different bills, and trying to understand what is moving forward and what is not has been next to impossible. So can you give us a bit of a rundown there on the GMA? Is climate change going to be a new requirement for the cities and the county? And what about ADUs and upzoning for single family residences and funding for residential projects?
Yeah, I think another issue the legislature obviously was trying to tackle is affordable housing. So there is this what's called a middle housing piece of legislation that has passed both the Senate and the House, that would allow, it's basically going to require cities to look at infill, require them to zone for infill for ADUs and for duplexes, especially in our smaller cities. The larger cities will be required to zone for duplexes, fourplexes, and even sixplexes if they're within a half mile of a bus line. I think this is an issue that, a lot of people have mixed feelings to, but at the end of the day, as Senator Braun, the Republican minority leader, said, this is really an ultimate property rights, that you should be able to build a second dwelling on your property if you choose so. I think the city of Port Angeles and some of the cities in our area will be looking at this. I think it's a challenge. I think it's a complicated piece of legislation, but at the end of the day, the hope is that it will really begin to provide an opportunity for infill. With regards to ADUs, again, I mentioned it on the call I was on earlier, and pretty frustrating. I had a bill that was supported by the realtors to allow ADUs, detached ADUs, to be allowed in non-urban growth areas, so outside the urban growth. as long as they met the county requirements for water and sewer. So, you all know in our non-urban growth areas, we have houses on 2.5, 5, 10 acres. And they can general, state, we were, my bill was trying to encourage ADUs on those pieces of property. Generally would be for mother-in-law apartments and those sorts of things. Came out of committee, bipartisan. Had bipartisan sponsorship, and the governor's office just killed it, and literally just came out in strong opposition. So
did he kill it in making testimony, or his staff having quiet conversations, or was it a veto?
No, he killed it ahead of, both in their staff testimony, and then key leaders letting the committee know that in essence they don't support the legislation, would veto it. It's under the guise that we don't want more sprawl. But it really, it was, even for some of the urban Democrats, they were pretty frustrated that the governor's office came out so early. So that's frustrating for those. I don't have any answer for a governor that would oppose a piece of legislation that would help the rural areas provide more housing. I cannot defend it. And I think people, so we focused on cities. So again, all your growth is going to go into cities. So for those who live in cities, your growth, you're going to get denser. And for those who live outside of cities, I will say I was frustrated and let them know that the Port Angeles City Council had also opposed that bill. And they also opposed a bill that Senator Vanderway put in that would have allowed an opportunity to access more water for development outside of cities. And I let the city council know it's pretty different. They had a meeting with us in Olympia, and they had a whole list of things they wanted us to do for them. And then they were opposing the two key pieces that Kevin and I were working on. And I kind of let them know it was pretty difficult when they show up to Olympia to oppose two of our signature pieces of legislation, and then wanted us to do a bunch of work for them and give them a bunch of money. So that was a tense conversation, and probably lost it. But it's true. You'd be neutral at least on the legislation that Senator Vanderway and I are working on to allow for more housing outside of the cities. But the cities have a position. The city of Port Angeles specifically wanted all the growth to happen inside the city limits. But yeah, it's not realistic. I mean, I live there. I talk, I'm looking around my neighborhood, I'm like, there's not a lot of room. I mean, for too much housing in the city of Port Angeles. So we do have to have some access. So anyway, not to if anybody from the cities here, but they got it was a frank conversation. But we could use a little more support on some of these issues sometimes. But that's the most mean thing I'll say today. So it's not mean, it's just the facts.
So Wendy.
Morning, Mike.
Good morning.
Hey, so I'm actually going to follow up on housing. I won't beat you up about behavioral health, because the House did a really great job in your operating budget on that. Thank you. But so I know it's too late this session, but it is very unattractive to be a landlord in the current environment in the state of Washington. And I just want to put a plug out there that, as we're closing out this ledge session, starting to think about next year, one of the things that we have to do is look at some of the landlord tenant law stuff, because it has become increasingly difficult to convince people that they should rent properties that they have outside of the short-term rental market, because it is so unattractive and so difficult to manage your own property as a landlord these days. So, I don't think that there's any fix for that this year, but as we're continuing to battle this housing situation, that is one of the things our state has to do. The pendulum has swung from, all about the landlord to all about the tenant, and we've got to find some middle ground there if we're going to successfully get some of our short-term rentals back into the long-term rental market and encourage people to take on multifamily housing projects. Because it, as a not-for-profit, we're going to take some of that risk, but as a private entity, it makes it really, really unattractive.
Yeah, there's a question in there, and you're right, and I don't
The
disagree.
question is, what can we do, Mike?
Yeah, well, so I have, if you looked at my voting record, I have a long voting record of supporting the landlords and the landlord association, and but I work in a place where it's really one-sided, and so we really have driven individual landlords out of the rental business, and I'm one of them. I mean, I had a rental, and when I went 6 months without rent and took forever to get the person out and had a mess on my hands and a house that was damaged, I fixed it up and said, I'm never doing that again. And I sold it. And it's now just a single family home. But so that's, one of the few issues that really does divide the Republican and Democrat Party in Olympia. And right now, my party is 100% supportive of tenant rights and generally pretty oppositional to landlords, even though they're beginning to realize that there are fewer and fewer landlords in the state. But you have to look at their perspective is they don't deal with individual landlords in King County. They deal with the big firms and the big buildings. And so to them, they've tried to approach it from that perspective. And when you talk to them about the individual landlord in rural areas, they just don't have a kind of a clue. So it's a pretty challenging issue. Truth be told, you'd have to have a different governor and a different legislature to roll back any of those policies. Even though many of us, there's a coalition of us who don't vote for them. We get a lot of heat for it, including from our own district and people in the district who don't understand sometimes, and they're just reflectively wanting to support. I get beat up from members of my own party in Clallam and Jefferson County for the votes that I take on supporting landlord rights. But we basically have lost. I don't know. I'd be curious, how many people on this call know of somebody who's gotten out of being a landlord because of the rules. Yeah, I mean, but it is that one's a very partisan issue, unfortunately, and we haven't found a lot of middle ground yet.
Mike,
Thanks for your candor.
Bill, go ahead.
Thanks, Colleen. Good afternoon, Mike. I'm Bill Dowling. I get to be the director of the Olympic Workforce Development Council. So we kind of organize workforce activities under the Workforce Investment Act mostly, but we have some asks in the budget, in the proviso that is currently in there, and the little difference, the House, and I want to thank you, have supported additional dollars for what we refer to as business navigators. And for us, this region is a dedicated person on the peninsula to assist businesses in their recruitment, developing of apprenticeships, all kinds of stuff specifically targeted to that. And I just wanted to put in a good word for that one, and hopefully in this position, the House will prevail. It is not funded in the Senate's bill. And so we're really hoping that will prevail, because it really is vitally needed. It's the number one issue that we hear, certainly, is hiring. Where do we find people? And we know we need to develop our own talent. Colleen and I have worked somewhat on this. Let's trying to align our training programs and various things. But this will be a big help to have somebody really dedicated toward building local apprenticeships and covering that mile, really one-on-one meeting the local business community needs. This has never been done before, but we really feel like it's a positive, and it would allow us actually 2 reps for our region, but one specifically dedicated in the peninsula is really my concern. We don't get this type of normal funding, and this would really be an opportunity to assist businesses in a unique way, which our federal dollars unfortunately prohibit us really serving businesses as it's supposed to, because it's all client dollar focused. And we want to make sure that we have business dollar focus specifically to work with them on their hiring needs. So just that little plug. And I don't know if you have any info on where that might be going in the discussions, but I wanted to at least point out to you what that exactly is, because sometimes it's lost in language in legalese, but it's really about a position on the peninsula. Thank you.
Well, yeah, you said it was in the House budget, but not the Senate. So therein lies the rub. That, again, the Senate budget's a little more austere and puts a little more money in this rainy day account. So I'm not sure if you were in the Senate, not in the House, you'd have a better chance of it staying. I will worry. That one's going to be probably tricky when they negotiate the budget, but I would assume you have folks kind of talking to the key senators as well.
Yeah, we do. Amber is our information person, our lobbyist, I guess, as it were. And then we're also making calls specifically. We know our senators in the area actually do support this because they know of the need. But as you know, statewide, that's not always seen. Something perhaps in King County or other areas that have additional resources to be able to develop those. But our businesses here don't have that. And the vast majority really focuses, these dollars all focus on small business, which we know drives our economy. So thank you for the consideration.
Thanks, Bill. Jim.
Good morning, Mike. As you might remember, one of my many mottos is you can sleep when you die. And when sine die happens, then you can get some shut eye. So hang in there, buddy. Question on a policy bill that came out of your committee. It's 1789, deals with carbon sequestration, state trust lands and all that kind of things. Really, really good bill. I just checked on it. It looks like it's kind of hung up in the, I don't know if that's the right way to characterize it, but it still sits in the Senate Appropriation Bill or Appropriation Committee. Give me some insight on the prospects for that bill passing, because I think that's a good way to create policy that then supports the money that's currently in the operating budget right now. That's we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Jim, and I appreciate your perspective, because I think you realize that bill, it was a bill that it was a DNR request legislation. I sponsored it. I started moving it, but clearly, and I knew at the beginning it wasn't in a good spot. And I think you weighed in, and Rod Fleck from Forks and other around the district kind of weighed in early that this was not, the original bill was not in a good spot for our district. But I really appreciate how you framed the question, because you realized that a lot of work went into it, that when it came out of committee and it was in a much better place, when it came off the House floor, it was in a better place. So, and it's just, I appreciate that you realize it's a good bill where it's at.
Yeah,
it is in trouble in the Senate. It does not look like it's going to move. Another bill that the executive branch, along with the Seattle environmental folks, weighed in opposition. But think about this. This was a bill, and it initially was a little too broad, but it is a bill to allow DNR, your Department of Natural Resources, to begin to approach the carbon market. Are there lands that maybe aren't being managed for, now that we've got it in a good spot? It wouldn't take productive timberlands, but are there lands that either they want to reforest and could sell carbon credits? They want maybe eelgrass, some of the kelp beds. Could they enter the carbon markets, and they don't have the statutory authority? Why the Seattle environmental community and why the executive branch, again, weighed in on a bill that would have been another revenue stream. Now, our junior taxing districts, still right. Timber harvest are still the predominant revenue source, but this was going to give another revenue stream and was going to allow DNR to maybe find some lands that had either been burned or weren't being, and acquire them and really set this market up. So there is a budget proviso working through, which would in essence take the bill and kind of give DNR some money to begin to acquire some of these lands for this project. Much like the riparian bill that Ron Allen worked on, we have some money working through the budget. We are hearing the governor may veto those sections out of the budget. Wow. We're trying to write them in a way that maybe his office won't. I'm inclined at this point, the legislature has worked on these are two widely bipartisan pieces of legislation. And if he wants to veto the spending piece, so be it. And I think the public should know, and he should explain to the community, to the state, why he doesn't like the approach on riparian recovery between ag and tribes, and why he wouldn't want DNR to have this authority and move forward. So these are some frustrating issues, Jim, but we did our part as a committee, we did our part as the House, and we delivered a good bill to the Senate. And now it's just in the budget process. We'll come back for the policy. We'll take another bite at the apple on both of them. I promise you, I will have hearings on both of those bills next session at my committee, and we'll take another look at it. But and this gets into an issue, Jim. I know you and I have had, I think we governor's authority, vetoes, those sorts of things. I am happy to please that for my first time in the legislature, we actually overrode some governor vetoes from last year.
Yeah.
and overrode them with unanimous votes. And I think you're seeing, again, we live in a pretty political world with one, the executive branch and the legislative branch. When they're of the same party, it's a little more tricky for the legislative branch to step in. But I think you're seeing the legislature in a couple of areas reassert its role as an equal branch of government. I didn't really care what the bills were. I was just glad that we said, you know what, we're going to override those vetoes, and they were dumb vetoes. They were vetoes for no reason, and they were good pieces of legislation that we'd passed. So I'm not so sure.
Were they? What were they, Mike? Do you remember?
Yeah, I didn't even. They were too little. They were two fixes for specific industries that I can't. We did it so early. I'm sorry, I can't remember I just was like. But I will say there is, the governor can veto sections out of spending bills, but the legislature could override those vetoes. So we'll see. But
That's right.
Have you been tracking?
Jim, I will say we passed new rules this year. We've had this issue. Can the legislature, we now can call ourselves back into session specifically for veto overrides for 5-day sessions. We put it in the rules. That is now in the legislature. So again, we're sending a message to the executive branch that you had 2-3 years of pretty unchecked power through the pandemic, and for whatever reason, and I disagreed with that approach, but the majority of the legislature, but now I think the legislature's realizing, hey, dang it, we're an equal branch, and we give our new leadership team. They put some new rules in place working with the Republicans. So now we can call ourselves back into special session specifically for veto overrides for a 5-day special session if needed. And I suspect that's a good message to send the executive branch. And I suspect that if certain things, maybe we exercise that this year, and that would be a good thing. I was on a podcast the other day talking about you want tension between the legislative branch and the executive branch. And that tension should always be there, and that's healthy. And even if they're the same party, and that's a good process. And that's something I support, is the natural tension that we should have between the executive and legislative branch at all times.
Exactly. Very good. Well, more to follow on that, Mike. I want to be available to be part of the solution on that process. I see this as something like the ag bill between the tribes and the ag industry. There's a way to have that conversation here just in the same fashion. So I think that would be a good thing if we could do that.
If I could just put it, there is a move afoot, and I said during this process that there are those who want to use DNR lands for carbon sequestration only.
Right.
And that I said, in the debates and some of the negotiations I had, I said, people may think I'm nuts but I said within 3 to 5 years, that's going to be kind of a mainstream thought coming out of Seattle. Actually, I was quickly proven to be wrong, because I said 3 to 5 years, because
no, it's now.
A resolution showed up from the state Democratic climate work group, and it was a resolution asking the legislature to begin to move to permanent sequestration of carbon on our working forests. So I was widely over. So it's right here. It's an issue that the legislature, and some would say, well, you didn't get a lot passed out of your committee. And as chair, that maybe, do you feel frustrated? People have asked me, do you feel, and I'm like, well, the role of the chair is not just to see what you can move forward. The role of the chair is also to stop policies that may not be in the best interest of the state, and certainly my district. So I'm going to be, this isn't, and I'm looking around, I'm trying to see how many of my Democratic friends are on this call, but I'm the many Washington Democrats want to move to full on carbon sequestration and no more logging. And that is, I have the resolution. And that's going to be a rub that's going to be a point of contention for me with my party moving forward.
It doesn't, here, the Department of Commerce said we need 1.1 million new units, housing units, by 2040 in our state. And the options are using timber or using steel or concrete. And timber is a renewable resource and has the life cycle analysis of using timber versus concrete or steel. It is a small percentage of the carbon emissions. So to me, so what are we going to do? Import from other areas? I mean, that just doesn't make any sense. To me, it's not logical. I would love to have a logical, non-emotion based conversation to
Right.
understand their perspective.
Well, and I have a report from the University of Washington and Washington State and University of Washington. I have a report on my desk. I get a lot of reports. This is one that I've read cover to cover, and it scientifically details the life cycle of a tree and where that tree is sequestering the most carbon, and at what point in that life cycle of that tree does it quit sequestering and begins to slough off carbon
Right.
as it gets so. But then finally, at no point in human history really can anybody document that if a forest is left, its life cycle is death, generally through
Right.
wildfire. And the number 2 carbon emitter in our state is wildfires after the transportation sector. So for those who say we want to lock up our public lands for carbon sequestration, that's great. Could be 20, 60, 80, but at some point that carbon will be released through the forest deteriorate. And if you walk through an old growth forest, there's a lot of there's huge trees, but then there's not like a lot of trees have fallen over the years and they're decaying and they're releasing their carbon. But ultimately, too, fire will. We think we're insulated on the North Olympic Peninsula from fire. We're at 73% of our snowpack, I think it was, or 80% of our snow. We are overdue for fire. And you drive, if you wonder what a healthy forest doesn't look like, just drive up into the Buckhorn.
Yep.
Drive up right out of Squim, get to the Forest Service land. In places you can't even walk through. The trees are so skinny and so packed in together, and it's crying out for a fire, and that will release carbon. So it is an interesting debate. It is one but the scientific community is really clear. We could have this, but it is frustrating for those who want to tell us, as Superintendent Reckdahl says, Bellevue and Seattle have high rises and they have a lot of property taxes for schools, and our high rises are our trees, and that's revenue to our junior taxing districts. But also that if you put it into a home, and homes don't burn near to the rate of world, a home can burn, but we're probably not going to see the entire city of Port Angeles burn, right? And release all that carbon. And anyway, yeah.
Mhm.
Being a rural Democrat in endangered species is a challenge sometimes. I'll just put that on the record. Ron Allen used to say he's an endangered. I'm quoting Ron. He has said he's an endangered species because he's a Native American Republican, and I've co-opted that and said, as a rural Democrat, I think I'm an endangered species.
Are you you and Steve Farringer the only, and on the Senate side, are there any other Republican rural legislators?
There are a couple, but we're the third largest legislative district. We're the most rural still. To my Republican friends, I'm sorry, but we're the most rural still held by 3 Democrats. Although you all try to get rid of us every 2 years. So, and this is the other thing. You have friends. I told Representative Kretz, who's the minority leader, the deputy minority leader in the House. I mean, we're great friends. And we were talking the other night, and now, it's a public meeting, but we were after hours, so we were enjoying a beverage of our choice. And I looked at him. I said, "Damn it, Joel, you're such a nice guy, and I really like you. It's too bad your job is to get rid of me." Every 2 years he puts a team together, and and then that's, at least we're on it. But he's like, we don't really try that hard. But I'm like, yeah. So but it is difficult because there are issues that we, Steve and Kevin and I, and we kind of battle our own party. Sometimes we battle our own party more than we battle the minority party on some of the issues. And I had a pretty tough earlier this year. an issue came up and I got pretty frustrated and I wondered, fighting for your districts when other people have a different perspective of where they want to go can be a little challenging. But, hey, I look around the table, you're all Wendy, Matthew, people in lead, Mike, you guys are battling issues all the time, federal regulation. So I'm not complaining. It's just, I know that Mike Maxwell is committed to healthcare on the peninsula, right? 100%, but he's got battles, he's fighting. It's not easy. All of us are on this call because we love this area and we all are trying to pull in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. So Susie, Dr. Ames from Peninsula College has a question, please.
Thanks so much. And thank you so much for your commitment and ongoing support for higher education, Mike, and community colleges. I know you get it and we truly appreciate it. I know the Democrats had a priority for workforce out of this session. It doesn't look like the community colleges are going to get much, if anything, for workforce development. I'm kind of wondering what the behind the scenes conversation was. We had asked for $75 million for community colleges to start new programs to meet economic demands and to shore up ones that we have that we don't get enough funding to operate. But it looks like what ended up happening is a couple specific colleges got called out for specific projects, which were not one of, probably some backroom negotiations happened outside of the community college system. So I'm just wondering if you have any insight into how we got there.
I'm sorry, Dr. Ames, I really don't. And I also saw that and somewhat reminiscent to a bill that we passed the other night that would give extra funding to the Toppenish Community Hospital, but looks like our community hospitals are going to lose their direct funding this cycle. So sometimes it's just, we just only have a handful of people that control the $60 billion budget in Olympia, and sometimes they have different perspectives and different priorities, and we can only do so much. You might check with Senator Vandeweghe, though. He is on Ways and Means in the Senate. He might have some input. But I do worry about the loss of revenue to our hospitals. That's going to be a big hit to both OMC and Grace Harbor Community Hospital. And I think it's well reported that OMC is probably can't stay on the financial trajectory they're on for too much longer.
I don't know if John Nutter is on, doesn't look like he is, but I know that
so we've had a direct appropriation for them in the last 4 budgets. Does not looks like that direct appropriation money is going to go to Toppenish this year.
So I know that OMC lost 16 million in 2022, and in January they lost $1.4 million. So that's obviously not going in the right direction.
Yeah, I think that should be setting off alarm bells community-wide. And I think the potential loss of services, especially, is, and maybe Mike has some more input on that.
Yeah, actually, I do a little bit. I'm not directly involved. I talk with Daryl a lot, and my sense in talking with him is that much of that loss directly relates to lack of workforce. Having to pay traveling nurses, traveling physicians, they're substantially more expensive to bring on. So that's if John were on, he could confirm that, but that's my understanding is that's a big driver. And I guess backside, the workforce issues, and I think there were some. That's why there was so much heartburn around the staffing ratio bill. It just because of the lack of workforce and what the implications it could have had. And I know there was a little carve out for OMC and the North Peninsula, but yeah, so workforce is a big driver for that.
We did pass, it looks like legislation to allow an easier pathway for out-of-state nurses to get licensed in Washington. That appears to be moving forward. And there was a negotiated agreement on the nurse staffing ratio bill between the nurses union and the hospital association. That That's one I think Steve and I voted in favor on the House version. I think Senator Vandeweghe voted no on the Senate version, but I do know we'll be concurring on that. But the idea is maybe not to use these travelers as much, but it has been difficult to get, apparently, to get licensed from out of state. There's a couple of bills that we've tried to make the licensure process easier, but it has been difficult for Washington State to license, but looks like we got a pathway there.
We just have to find a way to get more people. There's bottlenecks in the education training side, and trying to crack that nut upstream is going to be key. That's going to be a while. I don't think there's a huge workforce of. I think people left during the pandemic, left the profession in droves, and may never come back. And they're retired. They're just gone. And so there's this gaping hole at all levels in the workforce, the healthcare workforce, that man, we're scratching our heads about trying to find a way to plug those holes. And here on the peninsula, we realize we don't want to scavenge from each other. I mean, we all want each other to do well, to be able to be staffed, but we can't find them. So we have to try and create them, and quickly. And that's these workforce and training dollars are so important.
So Dr. Ames,
and then
are
it's
you
a challenge if they do want to come here, can they find a place to live?
That's the other question. Yeah.
My son works for OMC and he's in the HR department. He goes to job fairs and he talks to people all the time, and maybe they'll even come up and look, and they want to live here, they want to work here, and then they look around, they can't find a place to live, and they take a job in another community. So yeah, my son's 27 and he kind of gets on me for this stuff. He's just like, you guys are missing the point. People want to be here, they can't find a place to live. And then he was pretty upset that my ADU bill went down. He's like, do people understand that we can't get the workforce? I mean, he's right in the middle of it. So he, there's a 27-year-old who was pretty upset that his dad couldn't get a bill passed. That's always a fun Easter conversation, Easter dinner. Get more criticism from your own kid than any of you.
So Dr. Ames, are you seeing a lot of demand or growth in your healthcare programs?
No, to be frank. I'll be really curious to see this spring what our nursing applications look like. Our nursing applications were down last year for the first time ever. We have lots of anecdotal thoughts on why, but we really do not know why. And so we're anxious to see if they're up. So for the first time ever, we did not have a full cohort of nursing students. Medical assisting is low, despite the massive need in the community, and all of our healthcare entities increase the salary they're paying for medical assistants to try to make.
What?
Mike, what's your new salary?
We're in the 20-26 range.
So I know Jamestown started it, and it kind of ripple effect, everyone followed suit. So now the cost benefit analysis of going to school is better, and every single student that walks into medical assisting gets $1,000 scholarship right off the bat. No, you don't need to show any need or anything. You just, we'll write you a check just to try to get more folks in the door. There's more funding coming from our local community for that, but I worry that the pandemic showed the underbelly of healthcare and how hard it can be, and folks are stepping out of the workforce in lots of different areas, and healthcare is one that's just becoming really apparent. So we've got to get more creative in convincing young people when they're in high school that there are really solid careers here. You can stay in your community, you can make a really livable wage job, you can have a really awesome career trajectory, starting out at a low level skill with a pretty good paycheck and work your way up. We got to get that message sent with the young people starting in middle school and high school.
Isn't there a problem with trying for someone that wants to become a medical assistant and then, or a CNA, and then become a nurse, that those courses that you take don't, they're not able to be stacked, that you have to basically start over?
Yes. That's required by the Nursing Commission.
That is just crazy. That is, I mean, you would think that the experience that a CNA or a medical assistant would get could serve towards some of those requirements to get an RN degree.
Mike?
No?
I'm going to let Mike talk about that. I don't work in healthcare.
Yeah, I think you're totally right, Colleen. In my opinion is that it's an intentional bottleneck to restrict the supply and create market leverage in negotiations. When you have a smaller supply of workforce, it helps with negotiating with your employers. So I think it's a broader strategy.
But isn't it the state Board of Education that what'd you call it, Susie? That
It's the Washington State Nursing Commission.
so, and is that not associated with Washington State Board of Education, or is that totally just?
Totally, totally separate. And they tell us what we have to teach.
Wow. That is goofy. That is something, Mike, you ought to.
I'm
Someone
very
ought to write a
grateful.
bill about.
I'm just sitting here grateful I don't serve on either the healthcare committee or the higher ed committee. I think I'll stick with my ag and natural resource transportation and business and consumer protection committees just fine.
Smart man, Mike, smart man.
No, I mean, I'm not, therein lies the rub on some of these issues, but healthcare is not the only industry where we're short of workforce. Andy, if you want to go work for the ferry system, this is a great time to go apply for the ferry system too. And I mean, we lost a lot of workers across the board. Department of Transportation is saying,
we hire them, Mike.
What's that?
They need
What,
to be
Debbie?
rehired. There are people that would come back to work for the ferry system if it weren't for being forced out because they made a medical choice.
Oh, you're talking about mandates.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. But I don't think that's anything that Representative Chapman supported. And that certainly was a governor's mandate, not the legislature.
Well, I'm glad to hear that the legislators gave themselves the option to be called back into service. So if something like that were to happen again, they can actually exercise their legislative power. Mike, one thing that I wanted to mention earlier, when Wendy was speaking about the landlords, you are correct. There are houses that I am aware of in this town that are sitting vacant. I know a lady that has 4 houses, and she's made the comment, I would rather let them sit and rot than to re-rent them. So I'm on a mission to try and preserve the housing stock we have now and to open up more available space in the UGA areas outside the city. So I need some help putting some pressure on the city when it comes to the sewers. Actually moving forward, I have met with my engineer with the city and now with the county, and hopefully we can get everybody to see the big picture and we can work toward expanding the availability of land to put housing stock on.
Yeah, anecdotally, I live on the Cherry Hill neighborhood by the, not a couple blocks from the Catholic Church, and over the 20-year period, generally all the long-term rentals have turned into Airbnbs.
Mm-hmm.
And that is one of the pieces of legislation work in part of the middle housing bill. We had one bill that I voted no on, but if we rolled it, and it's for King County only, if you build an ADU and you rent it long-term, you won't pay property tax on your ADU. I voted no, not that I'm opposed to the policy. I voted no because one of the things that the House Democrats, one of our slogans is we're one Washington. And when we try to keep the idea that policy that's good should be good for the entire state. And I thought that was, why would we just do that in King County? I think our rural areas if you want to put it at ADU and long-term rent it, you should also get the same property tax exemption. So we're close to getting some good policy, and that would be a real benefit. Like if you built an ADU and you rented it long-term and you had a property tax exemption on that building, that's a real incentive. And I suspect people in King County are going to take huge advantage. And the reason is it's not a tax break to local government because it would be tax revenue you never collected in the first place. But in essence, it would be a generator of housing stock, because one of the things people would realize is I don't want to, I probably can't afford the higher property taxes. So I think that it's a good policy. It's a 2-year bill. And if it works in King County, I mean, I think many of us are going to want to see something like that in rural areas as well. The other thing is,
Did it pass?
It did pass.
Okay.
I voted no, not that I'm opposed to the policy. I just believe in, if it's good for King County, it's, we're told, a lot of policies come out and my colleagues say it's good for the whole state, but it's generally a King County centric policy. A tax break like that should be a no-brainer to go to the whole state. Again, it's not a loss of revenue because the ADU doesn't exist. So it was for new ADUs for long-term rentals.
Well, one of the advantages of an ADU is you're probably living on the property, and so you can control and put stipulations in on the renters to make sure they're upholding the standards of your property.
Sure.
When you're a landlord of a property that is out of the area, or you're out of the area, you don't have that control. So that's why, like Wendy said, we need to address the Landlord Tenant Act's retroactive, I think.
Yeah. All right. Well, I see it's 9:03, and I think this has been a really interesting conversation. I know Michael Smith had a question in the chat about union. So if Susie and Michael Maxwell and Mike Chapman would stay on, but I'll end it for everyone else, and maybe we can get his question answered. If you want to stay on, please do. But thank you everyone for joining us, and I hope you have a great rest of your week. Take care.
Thanks, Mike, for all you do.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thank you for everything.